Hi everyone, this is Chris Moralia from Transformative Ed Tech and T4 Ed Tech Consulting. So today we're going to be focusing on takeaways from the 2021 school year and taking a look at instruction and taking a look at some of the things that I learned from this experience that, as most people know, was probably the most traumatic experience not only for students but for teachers as well. First thing, as I said, we're going to take a look at the lessons from the 2021 school year. Um, the school year, like I said, affected everybody. And we want to take a look at how we can take this pandemic teaching. What did we learn and how do we go forward with this? So I'm going to focus on a couple things here that I learned from this experience. First of all, a little bit of history. I'm an 8th grade U.S. history teacher. I've been teaching for 36 years. And the school district I taught in is in Southern California. Um, the school itself is 98% Hispanic, and including last March and going all the way to June 4th, which was our last day of school here, we had a total of 15 months of remote learning. Our student population was highly affected by the COVID-19. There was numerous tragedies. Many students got sick. There were deaths within families, immediate family members, a lot of aunts and uncles, and just it was very, very traumatic for the students. So the whole overall experience was extremely difficult, but there's a lot of takeaways for myself as an educator in this whole process. So one of the first things I learned to do, and I try to do this all throughout my career as a teacher, is establishing those relationships with students. I wanted to make sure they were welcome. Now, typically in my class, in a physical classroom, what would happen is my students would walk in, I'd shake their hands, ask them how they're doing. Obviously, that didn't happen with remote learning, but I had to figure out a way to connect with them. And what I'm going to show you here, I did this even before pandemic teaching, if we want to use that term, pandemic teaching. So I would have weekly check-ins. Give you a little bit of history once again. The school I taught at was on a block schedule. So we had 8 periods, and I taught all of my odd periods on Monday and Thursday, all of my even periods on Tuesday and Friday, and Wednesdays were used to alternate evens and odds. So when my students would come in the classroom, what they would see is this. They would get a Google form. When they log into their Zoom, they would immediately get a Google form, and I would ask them how their weekend was, because I realized that I'm not talking to them, and most of my students never came on screen the entire school year, and some of them never interacted with me at all. So this is one way I could talk to them. I wanted to find out how they were doing. Uh, a student who is affected by, well, especially with the trauma of COVID, um, isn't going to be able to learn very well. That's the bottom line. So I tried to do the best I could to interact with them. And so they'd get this check-in form, and I'd have them describe things that they might have done over the weekend. And this was really important for the students. Asking them about family gatherings, and his students were always good about sharing the information with me, and this was real important because I felt like I was connected to them. Now, I also would ask them if there's things that I should know, and that was real important because this is where I found out about illnesses, deaths. Wi-Fi was a huge problem in our district. There was just so many problems with connectivity, or as I say, disconnectivity, that affected learning that just went on through the entire school year. I also used Pear Deck in this process as well. So besides using Pear Deck, I was Google Forms, and I used the Pear Deck, the SEL check-in, and the students would simply drag their icon here to how they were feeling, and the second follow-up question was asking them what they did during the weekend. So this was highly effective because it gave me immediate feedback, and it's so important with a teacher to see this, especially in this situation. And I could obviously, if I needed to, we could have a breakout room discussion with the student one-on-one or they would just send, I got a lot of students that would just send me direct messages in this process. So the next thing as far as takeaways was keeping it simple. So here on our left, we see this is my first ambitious week of instruction. First 2 ambitious weeks of instruction. A lot of things going on here. This is all good, but believe me, I've been doing this for a long time, so I figured, okay, let's just roll. And it was soon very apparent that I had to scale down things. I had to keep it simple. Focus on a few key things. Okay, now what I put here was obviously important, the class introductions, which I did on Flipgrid, course navigation. I had to teach the students how to use Zoom, but as far as instruction and content, I really had to scale down what I was doing. And I take a look at what Thoreau said, just keeping everything, simplifying it, and we could apply that as teachers, okay? Teachers, we don't need to give them the 150 standards our students. They don't need that, and it doesn't show that it makes learning any more effective. So by keeping things simple, and as Thoreau says, keeping your accounts on your thumbnail. So I guess if you take a look at my weekly plan, by the time I got to week 15, this is what my instructional model looked like on Canvas. Pretty simple. So keeping it simple. The next takeaway. And I actually was gravitating towards this actually last school year. No more test or graded quizzes. Now, I do want to say that I used quiz is, but it was never for a grade, and we'll talk about that in the following episode here. So yeah, there was no more graded tests or quizzes. One, I found my students would not study for them anyway. It was extremely difficult for them to take a test or graded quiz, and how was I to if I gave them a multiple choice test, they could just look up the answers anyway. And what point would that be? So I decided, well, we're going to make this as authentic as possible. So instead of test or graded quizzes, my assessments focused on choice board assessments. And there would typically be a question from the unit. This is one from the Civil War, where students could choose a question, something that they had legitimate interest in. And so there was many different types of questions. By the way, my Civil War unit, which is usually 2 to 3 weeks, was 1 week. And this is how I did it. On that week, I did a little thing about we learned about the background of the Civil War, and I also did a unboxing with using a Civil War, my Civil War uniform. So I kind of got them hooked, and then I allowed them to then choose these different questions. And as you can see, I built up the Wakelet. Myself and my student teacher built up the Wakelet resources so they could simply access these and go with what interested them. Once again, developing that student agency, which I think is so important. So this created that engagement. As I said, the students were highly affected by what was going on at home. The background noise, I couldn't even imagine giving them a test and there was all these things that are going on in the background. There's no way they could do it. But if I said, okay, look, I'd give them class time, usually class time to work on their projects. It might be 2 class periods. The other thing is the relevancy. When students have ownership in the learning process, they are more apt to engage and produce, and also giving them options of how they reproduce that learning is extremely important. A lot of the research that's out there right now points to that reproduction of learning is so important for students to have. If I give them a test, that test, most of them weren't going to complete it, and I couldn't even force them to complete it because we weren't there. But if I give them a project, at least they'd have that engagement. And the reality was not all students completed the work. Okay, as I said, there were a lot of things that were going on that affected that. So that was the first part. What I'm going to do is break this up into 2 parts. The second part is going to be about the instruction. What did my actual instruction look like? What was the continuum? What were my favorite platforms and applications? And then final thoughts about learning and where we're going to go with that as this new school year starts in the fall.